with many African Americans, the years after the Civil War, as they became much more aware of having a job, the idea of voting was something that they wanted to do, but they were fearful. They feared the possibility of losing their own lives or their family members or their property being lost. Mostly they feared losing a job. Most of their employers in the South would tell them specifically, if you make any attempt to vote or even to register to vote, that you're going to lose your job. So a lot of people did not dare even attempt to register for fear that that would actually be the case. So with those fears in mind, when groups such as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and even the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party went into areas of the South and the Midwest to register people to vote, people still were very fearful. They had been told, number one, they didn't have the right to vote. That was not true. That's a right guaranteed in the Constitution, even to African American males, and then later as women gained the right to vote for African American females as well. But also there were other states that had other practices or other hindrances, again, that kept many blacks from voting. For instance, some were told that you had to have a grandfather who had been able to vote before the Civil War. Well, that not only kept some blacks from voting, it kept a lot of whites from voting as well in the South, because their grandfathers did not have the right to vote. Another hindrance was the paying of a poll tax, that if you were a citizen, you would have to pay for the right to vote. That was against the Constitution. You didn't have to pay for the right. You didn't have to earn the right. That was guaranteed by the Constitution, that as a citizen, you could vote. But because many states practice all these type of hindrances, it kept people just out of the loop, and they didn't even try to vote. When Bob Moses and the other groups that I mentioned, SNCC, CORE, the NAACP, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, started traveling around under what was called the Voter Education Project. It was headed by Bob Moses, a very soft-spoken man, but a man nevertheless who really brought the whole idea to a lot of people that you have the right to vote and you should vote. He was at one time told that African Americans didn't want to vote. But he said when people found out that they really could vote, oh yeah, everybody, including sharecroppers, everybody wanted to vote. Another type of hindrance was the taking of the literacy test to prove that you could read or write. The ironic thing about that is that a lot of the examiners who were white, who gave those tests, couldn't read or write themselves. Let me give you an example in the case of Fannie Lou Hamer, who worked with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She could read. She had a 6th grade education. When she went to try to register, she filled out the application, she read the information very well, but when her examiner realized that she could read, he added a second part. And that was where she had to explain what the law meant. And she couldn't do that, so she didn't pass the test that time. But she continued to go back every 30 days until she did pass the test. And then when she passed the test, she made it a personal challenge to get every black person in the state of Mississippi, and some whites as well, to register to vote. So that became very instrumental for her. Another thing, and these are some stories that I've heard and read, and then as senior citizens have come through the museum that they've shared with me. One was guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar to see if you would qualify to vote. Another was having the examiner to hold up a bar of soap and say, how many bubbles will there be in this bar of soap? Those seem to be, yes, very ridiculous, but those were the kinds of things that were done. In one part, I think this was in Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken, if you desired to have the right to register to vote, you would apply. There could be no mistakes on the application. No one could give you help in filling out the application. And then they would print your name and your address in the local newspaper for 2 weeks. And if no one had any objection to your registering to vote, then after a 2 or 3 week longer processing of your paper, maybe you might get to vote. The thing was, when they printed your name and your address in the paper, it gave your employer a chance to challenge you and to maybe remind you that if you try to register to vote, you can lose your job, or for any type of vigilante group to visit your house in the middle of the night, threaten you and your family. So for the signing or the passage, first of all, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that gave some priority to voter registration for the fact that discrimination on the basis of race, creed, color, who you were, where you came from, your beliefs, that became against the law. But then with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act rather, of 1965, that was signed by President Lyndon Johnson. That's the pen that we have here on exhibit. It's one of our artifacts at the museum. When that law was signed into effect, that then meant that no hindrance whatsoever could be used to keep a person from voting. If they were a citizen of this country, they didn't have to take a literacy test, they didn't have to pay a poll tax, they didn't have to qualify with the grandfather clause or guess the number of jelly beans in a jar, or even to know how many bubbles there were in a bar. So all of that was a part of an end to that type of hindrance. None of those things, it became unlawful for any of those things to be used.
Now, do you think it's how do you feel about African Americans voting today?
And voting, the right to vote is one of the most precious rights that we have as citizens of this country. In fact, the mantra, if you will, the slogan of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was "One man, one vote." One man, one vote. That same slogan was used by Nelson Mandela in his campaign to become the president of South Africa in 1994. It's a very precious right, and every African American who is eligible to vote should vote. All people should vote, but especially African Americans and any other minorities. I think they need to really understand that that is the one right that we have that can make a difference. People may not ever represent their city in the city local government. They may not ever go to Congress and represent the state, but they can represent themselves when they go to cast their vote. And that includes college-age students as well. If you're old enough to vote, you need to vote.